Hello and welcome to Crossing Channels, a podcast collaboration between the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge and the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse. This series is all about using the interdisciplinary strengths of both institutions to explore some of the many complex challenges facing our societies. I'm Rory Cellan-Jones, and today's episode asks the question, is it the government's job to make us happy? We're going to look at why some people think we need policies for happiness and what those might mean. To explore these issues today, we have Jonathan Stieglitz from the IAST. Jonathan, remind us of your main research interests.
Hi, I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, and I study health and well-being, both objective and subjective indicators of well-being, in small-scale, rural, subsistence societies, with a particular focus in the Bolivian Amazon, among two groups called the Tsimane and Moseten.
And from the Bennett Institute, we have Anna Alexandrova. Anna, what do you focus on?
I'm a philosopher of science, and I study how scientists use formal models and indicators to study phenomena that are far more complex and far more morally significant than any model or an indicator can capture.
Great. So we're going to have a stimulating discussion about happiness. And I'm going to start with a very basic question. How do we define happiness? How does it fit in with the concept of well-being? And how do we put a value on both? Anna, kick us off.
The first thing to say is that historically and culturally, both of these words are very contestable and defined in very different ways. So to come out and say, this is what happiness means and this is how it relates to well-being is always a step you take to erase other definitions. So what I'm going to say, though, is that in the present context in which governments are considering making happiness their object of work and in which they're bringing social scientists to provide evidence about it, this context forces a very specific definition of happiness as a psychological state that is largely positive rather than negative, and well-being, perhaps a wider state of life that includes happiness, but perhaps also other goals, such as being a member of a healthy community, having good physical and mental health, and other things.
Jonathan, what's your definition?
I would very much agree with Anna. I would characterize happiness as an emotional state. It's an emotion that's recognized cross-culturally. And in some broad sense, I think it can be experienced in really similar ways, regardless of cultural and other differences. Happiness happens when we feel really good, when we feel like things are going well. And one can also think about happiness as sort of one end of a continuum of broader psychological well-being, with sadness or emotions characterized by negative valence on the other end. When we talk about well-being, it's not just a synonym for happiness, but it includes things like one's comfort, prosperity. It's really a broader construct with various subcomponents.
Can we have some sort of scale of measurement of it? It's a kind of cliche to ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you? But can we as societies actually come up with any kind of objective measurement of it?
Well, the very scale that you mentioned, a variant of it is actually used. It's called Cantrell's ladder, and it can be used for things like life satisfaction or other questions where one is asked to basically point their position on the ladder. And it could be sort of in absolute terms, how happy are you? But it could also be relative to other individuals. So where on the ladder would you place yourself compared to others in your peer group? But I would also say, unfortunately, there's no biomarker of happiness. We rely on things like neurotransmitters, perhaps dopamine, to understand feelings of satisfaction, but there is no single biomarker, some objective measure. And so we're forced mainly to rely on self-reported and subjective measures using, as you said, Rory, scales or surveys. And so in these scales or surveys, items can focus on positively worded questions. Are you happy? Are you having fun, smiling, laughing? Or the items can focus on sort of negative valence. Are you sad? Are you unhappy? When you are sad, can you snap out of it? And other types of questions like this. And of course, these questions can be modified in some ways. Again, you can compare oneself to your peers, but you can also ask more open-ended questions and not force people to respond on some scale of 1 to 10, perhaps to get their own sense of what is actually inside their minds. And other measures include trying to solicit reports from other people by asking friends or family members. There are some novel methods that are increasingly being used called experience sampling, where essentially researchers can ping people on their cell phones systematically throughout the course of a day, asking them specific questions at that point in the day.
Anna, have you seen any objective measures, as it were, of happiness that you would respect?
Let me add to Jonathan's excellent summary that measurability of happiness has been an ambition since the 18th century. Scottish moral philosophers and English moral philosophers of the Enlightenment. In the past 30 years, and specifically with the rise of happiness economics and positive psychology, we have seen a proliferation of very many different self-reported, largely, measures of happiness and surrounding concepts. The tricky thing has been not just figuring out what is the right question to ask people when you want to know how well they're doing. The tricky thing has been showing that when you ask this question, the sort of data you receive, that what you've got here is a genuine indicator that picks out both people that are doing very well, people that are doing badly, as likely to pick out one as the other, covering the full spectrum, and so on. So these requirements of psychometric validity are the requirements that any measurer of happiness needs to demonstrate to say that the question they're asking people is not just plausible and doesn't just sound right and doesn't just feel like we're asking them to talk about happiness, but also is genuinely valid. And that's perhaps what you mean when you ask, is it an objective measure? Now, whether or not these self-reports obey those principles is a whole other question. Exactly how stringent of a requirement we're going to be setting there is a matter of great debate. And if you ask me for my opinion, have I seen an objective measure of happiness? No, I will answer. If you ask me perhaps a slightly weaker question, have I seen usable indicators that people do interesting things with? I'm going to answer yes.
So, which brings us on to, why should making us happier be a task for government? And actually, is it? I think you said that this is quite an old idea. The pursuit of happiness has been in some ways built into the mission of governments for many centuries, but there seems to be a new focus on it now. And why should we expect governments to do that? And is that a realistic expectation?
So let's distinguish between two really extreme views. One is, it is not government's job